So, if you are following what's been happening in northwestern China of late, you know that there has been a huge issue surrounding a people called the Uyghurs who live in an area called East Turkestan. And the Chinese claim that because of a series of violent events, they've had to crack down. And it's led to some really interesting discussions. So, we're going to talk about that today. I'm Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Ottawa, in Russell, Canada. And you're listening to Canadian Intelligence 8, which is a whole series of podcasts about national security, terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. And I am absolutely delighted today to be joined on my podcast by Kayum Masimov, who's the project manager of the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, which is an Ottawa-based organization that's working to promote the rights of Uyghurs and other natives of East Turkestan who've been living under Chinese occupation since 1949. So Kayum and I are going to have a conversation about what's happening in the area and, more importantly, what his organization is doing about it. So Kayum, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you, Phil.
And I loved your mug about not made in China. That's a brilliant. You got to show what this is. That's an absolutely brilliant mug. I love it.
Yes, I should get one for you.
You please do. So,
Yeah.
so Kayum, obviously, the issue of what's happening in East Turkestan is been made really important of late because, of course, the Canadian Parliament voted recently to label what's happening in that area of the world as a genocide. Okay, there's a lot of information out there, a lot of disinformation. Can you walk through my listeners, Kayum? What is the current situation in East Turkestan, and how did we get to where we are today?
Well, thank you, Phil, for inviting me, and I commend that you insistence on mentioning East Turkestan and not using it by its erroneous name Xinjiang, because Xinjiang it's a derivative name for the natives of this land. Xinjiang means new territory, new frontier in Chinese. It's been given to us by Manchu occupiers, invaders. And we refer to this as East Turkestan. Turkestan, it's not even ours. It's a Persian name given to us by ancient Persians in 7th century, and
Right.
it means land of Turks. Well, if I will come back to your question briefly, saying it is just a genocide, plain and simple. It is hell on earth. That's what it is. Yeah, very bad situation.
So obviously, the as I say, the Canadian Parliament recognized this as a genocide. I've been writing about this for the past 5 or 6 years. It seems to me quite clear that what China is doing in terms of essentially the elimination of an entire culture through things like, the so-called vocational centers, which you know better than I am, are actually concentration camps, the mass sterilizations, the elimination of mosques, all kinds of things. Do you think that the message about what's really happening in East Turkestan is getting across, or is China doing an effective job at trying to steer the conversation into a different direction?
I believe so. That China is very successful in its campaign of disinformation. This is not the new thing, It is not like 5 6 years it's happening. It's all of a sudden China decided to eliminate this ethnicity. It's been going on since 1949, the day it's been occupied. At that time, the People's Liberation Army came to our region with the promise that they will leave in 5 years and that they are fighting a capitalist, a nationalist army of Chiang Kai-shek. And they never promised and they never fulfilled this promise. In 1955, it's when Mao Zedong established the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
Mm-hmm.
And nowadays, if you look at the constitution of China, on paper at least, in theory, this region has all the rights of self-governance, including, let's say, deciding its own future, education, everything except probably external affairs and the army.
Right.
Everything else is given and promised as per Chinese constitution. But the thing is, the Chinese Communist Party never fulfilled or honored its promises. And I've been hearing that China in 2018 is not the same as China 2020.
Mm-hmm.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs has been saying this in his defense of the actions of the government, or rather, its inaction in dealing with the two Michaels case.
Right.
That
Right.
China has changed so dramatically, so rapidly. No, China is still the same. The governing party, which is the Chinese Communist Party, is still the same, which came in 1949. It is the same band of thugs and which terrorized not only Uyghurs and Mongols and Tibetans, but its own population, ethnic Chinese. Everything in the name of guarding and safeguarding its monopoly on power. That's the same ideology, same brutality, but the rhetoric and tactics changed. But that's the only thing. But the core issue still remains the same.
Now, would you say, Kayum, that there's been a significant deterioration in the situation since Xi Jinping took over from the previous Chinese premier? I mean, you know this obviously better than I do, and as you say, it's been going on for the better part of, well, well past half a century, since 1949. But have things gotten worse under Xi Jinping, in your estimation?
Definitely yes. In the past, Chinese government leadership used to applicate like or to how they say uh, to use two tactics like button and stick. And
Mm,
nowadays we're talking only about stick. There is no there is no carrot and stick. So it's
right,
only stick
right,
which is left, and
right.
there is no incentives or no like so-called naming. It's all open now. They even go as far as raising cemeteries, bulldozing them, and eradicating any kind of any trace of Uyghur heritage in this land. So in the future, no one will be claiming this ownership of this land. So this is simple, plain and simple imperialism, and it's
Mm.
worse, the colonialism, with the Chinese twist in it.
It sounds like almost like a scorched earth policy that you would see in a time of war, where there's a complete elimination. Like you said, even cemeteries are being raised. My God, I mean, how low can you go when you eliminate people's ability to bury their dead?
Oh yes, yes, and it's been proven by satellite imagery. I mean, you go and you Google it, and you can see ancient mosque, millennium old shrines, cemeteries. They bulldozed, destructed, knocked down the ancient city of Kashgar, in where Marco Polo used to wander, like
Mhm. Yes,
in 12th century, in 13th century. It's been razed to the ground, all in the name of modernism, of modernizing society, eliminating backwardness, and etc. etc. So this all rhetoric, it's not new. It's been there since 1949, but under different guises and under different pretexts. At the time, we've been used called Soviet puppets,
right,
capitalist bourgeois. So wherever the political wind will blow, this rhetoric will change. All of a sudden, in 2001, we've been declared as a terrorist,
right.
and that the China is combating a global fight against terrorism. But it's still there. It's just different tactics and rhetoric, but the core essence is still the same.
I'm glad, Kayum, you raised the issue of terrorism, because obviously we've seen, and I've commented on this on many occasions, that a lot of nations have used the so called war on terrorism for all kinds of purposes, some of which may have a tenuous link to terrorism, some have no links at all. Now, but in fairness, there certainly have been attacks that have been carried out allegedly by Uyghurs, perhaps some belong to the so called East Turkestan Islamic movement. There were some Uyghurs that did fight with Al Qaeda in Central Asia for some time. So I think on the one hand, these attacks did occur, and I think that we could probably label them as acts of terrorism. Now, of course, the Chinese government has gone well beyond those few attacks to justify, as we say, a cultural and actual genocide against the Uyghur people. Do you think that in the absence of these attacks, that the Chinese government would not have been as strenuous, as harsh in its reaction, or do you think the attacks are merely an excuse to continue a policy that's been around since the end of the Second World War?
Well, I would say that my grandfather, who was shot as a landowner and capitalist exploitator back in 1950s, has nothing to do with so-called terrorism, right?
Right,
It's
right.
just so subjective, and it's so how they say misused and misplaced, that any reference of China to terrorism and claiming that they are victims of terrorism is such a full, play. I would argue that China is the number one terrorist state.
Hmm.
It is governed by terrorists, and it's even in the constitution and its ideology of Marxism Leninism, and Mao Zedong's quotation that the power comes from the end of the barrel.
Right,
It is by terrorizing not only ethnicities that like ours, but its own population that is holding power and its monopoly on power, and decision making. There is no like opposing voices to be heard, or no one who can challenge this authority. Right? This
Hmm.
is absolute monopoly. So if we go to the core of the issue, it is the Marxist-Leninist ideology which is still in use, in place, which is of a terrorist nature, and it's come to the communist ideology that it's a eternal, permanent battle of exploited class against
Right.
the class which oppresses others.
Right.
If we come to the details, I very much doubt the claims of that China being became a victim of terrorism, especially Uyghur terrorism. In diaspora, I've been living in like and advocating on behalf of Uyghurs. Very few, if not a single Uyghur have heard about ETIM, so-called East Turkestan Islamic Movement.
Hmm.
It is a fabrication. This organization does not exist. I have never seen these people, let alone of any actions on it. In fact, U.S. Has designated this organization as non-existent and take it off from its terrorist list.
Hmm.
So what happened in 2003 when George Bush Jr. Listed this organization as a nebulous organization as a terrorist one? It was because to please China and to get their support in invading Iraq,
Hmm.
which they never did. China never supported this
Right.
invasion. So it's a long, long story. And about Al Qaeda and all these Middle Eastern states, there are some elements of radicalized youth who've been there, but there are far more Europeans who went to
Yeah.
Syria than any Uyghurs, fighting there.
Hmm.
And again, it would be erroneous to assume because of the acts of some individuals, you can punish collectively the whole
Right.
ethnicity and label them as a terrorist.
Mm.
And in fact, if China claims that they are victims of terrorism, it is in their advantage to invite independent media and
Hmm.
let media investigate and do these comments and reports on so-called Uyghur terrorism.
Right.
And why they not doing it, and why they not allow any independent observers to come and see for themselves and decide for themselves what is happening. So it is very subjective, and
Hmm.
it's very so much of a fog of the war, so
Yes.
much
Yeah.
discuss, so much of the he said, she said, and
Yeah.
finger pointing. When it comes to the like essence of the question, in our opinion and in opinion of many in diaspora, this is a terrorism state run by government. It is long planned, long term, strategic, uh, ethnocide, a
Hmm.
genocide. This
Right.
is what we living and experiencing. Yes.
I'm glad you brought up ETIM because I agree with you. In the research that I've done, there seems to be very little information to the actual formation of a concrete group called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. And I certainly do also agree with you that the acts of a few individuals, which could be construed as terrorist in nature, I mean, the independent reporting notwithstanding, should not be used to justify. And what China has done is said, look what happened in Kunming, look what happened here, look what happened here. We're going to basically use the examples of a few people to call for the complete destruction of the Uyghur culture, and that is where, as I've pointed out many many times, this whole war on terror, which is a really dumb term, which I wish we would get rid of, but the war on terror has been used by many countries to justify all kinds of acts against people. And we got to the point now where anybody who just opposes the government is called a terrorist. I mean, President Erdogan in Turkey is calling opponents of his government terrorists because they don't agree with his policies. Kayum, there's been a lot of reports that we've got in media, Western media, about the fact that people like yourself in the Uyghur diaspora, including here in Canada, have either been approached or have had messages sent to them to refrain from criticizing the Chinese government, to not say anything to make China look bad. And there have been allegations that threats have been issued, either against people in the diaspora or against their families who may still, in fact, live in East Turkestan. I know this is a very sensitive topic, and I don't want to push you too hard on this, but can you share with my listeners some idea of what the extent of this kind of pressure by Chinese, either Chinese agents or the Chinese government or people aligned with China, have been placing on the Uyghur diaspora here in Canada?
Sure, Phil. I mean, this is, it is a public secret that all activists who reside outside of China do become target of a Chinese campaign of intimidation and harassment. and me myself included, I was honored to be labeled as an international terrorist by
Mhm.
China in Geneva, at UN meeting. But nevertheless,
So I'm
let's
talking to a terrorist right now. Oh my god! I got to stop the
yes, yes.
podcast.
So it is honorary badge. I am, but that's like that put aside of my personal thing. It is like if you talk in general for the whole diaspora, let's say in Canada in particularly, uh, this is a public secret. That Chinese they intimidate. What they usually do they take family members as hostages.
Mhm.
Sometimes they make them call to Canada and send a message like veiled message. And they push relatives like oh, you should not go here, you should not protest, you should not write letters, keep silent. So this is a terrorist activity that the
Mhm.
government takes innocent people as hostages, and they push them to say something against their own will, right? This is a clear sign of terrorism,
Right.
regardless of political opinion, if you agree or not. But in the context of China, this is not possible. The diaspora is living in fear and intimidation. It's been going on for decades. This is not something new, and this is not unique to Uyghurs only. All our friends from Tibetan community,
Yeah.
Mongols, Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, they all complain about the same issue and more or less the same tactic and approaches used by Chinese security apparatus. We've been complaining about this to the CSIS and to the Canadian security establishments for
Mhm.
years.
Mhm.
And up to now, we haven't heard any like positive or let's say concrete and feasible reaction or feedback. Me myself, for example, I was threatened by death, and I was launching a complaint, and after a few months of investigating, they just came back and they suggested that I have to change my cell phone number. That's only they came out the only advice I have had. But nevertheless, it's we talk about relatives, diaspora members in Canada missing connection with their relatives, like 40,
Mhm.
50, 70 people close or like immediate relatives are missing, are gone, and there
Mhm.
is no traces. So not only the intimidation and harassment, it is a very little mentioned aspect of the issue is post-traumatic stress that
Right.
diaspora members
Right.
live in
Right.
Canada. Because some might think, okay, once you leave China and you cross the physical boundaries, the harassment and intimidation and this nightmare will end. But no, it follows you even to Canada,
Mhm.
because you cannot just simply cut off everything,
Right.
and you cannot not think about your missing relatives, friends with whom you went to school,
Mhm.
educated together, your neighborhood, your neighbors in your neighborhood, your friends, your teachers, and I would say one thing, there is not a single Uyghur family in Canada which is not missing someone back at home.
Wow.
And this is very profound. And when we talk about millions, this is not an exaggeration.
Mhm.
This is according to Chinese statistics itself, China
Mhm.
internal documents that they say, we educate or re-educate
Right.
1.6 million people per year.
Mhm.
And it's been going on for the last 6 years. So you do simple math,
Yeah.
and the number exceeds far more exceeds the UN officially recognized figure of 1 million.
Mhm. Very Orwellian language. I know
It is very
re-education.
Orwellian.
Can you tell me, Kayum? I'm just curious. If there's any statistics on the size of the Uyghur diaspora here in Canada, approximate numbers?
We do not have exact statistics.
Okay.
Winston Churchill used to say there are three types of lies in the world. Number one is a lie.
Lies, damn
Second
lies,
is
and
a damn lie.
statistics.
Exactly. So when I come to the statistics, we can. But my best guess would be well above 2,000.
Okay.
And we are scattered all across from Halifax to Vancouver. Same classic immigration pattern as any
Right.
Canadian diaspora in Canada, exiled diaspora. I would say that we are probably the newest
Hmm.
and the smallest ethnic community in Canada.
Okay. Okay, and I
Probably.
definitely have met. Well, I've met you, of course. I've met some others as well, part of the diaspora. I'm guessing that this campaign of pressure and threats by the Chinese government has probably had an effect on not just from a PTSD perspective, but I'm going to assume that some people have chosen not to speak out anymore for fear of having their families harmed back home. And again, I don't want any details from you, but that's probably true, right? There are those that have elected to stop saying things because they don't want anything to happen back to their families in China.
Well, by my own estimate, I would guess the majority of people they choose to they prefer to stay silent,
Right,
or if they will testify, they would prefer to remain anonymous.
right, right.
Even in Canada, we do have few people, who've been actually who came out from these concentration camps, and they went through this ordeal, and they know firsthand what is
Wow,
happening.
wow.
But they are so much afraid for the
Yeah,
remaining relatives back at home that they do not want to come forward and reveal what's happening. Uh, this is a profound generational impact we
yeah.
are having, and I just hope that one day the leadership of CCP will face the day just like Nazis did after
Right.
the fall through. So we will have Nuremberg process
Yeah.
too, probably. I would hope, and I would very much love to see this, and I hope in my lifetime,
Hmm.
I would be witnessing this.
I think that's a very good analogy you've made, Kayum, between the atrocities that the Nazis committed during, up to and leading into World War II. And of course, you cited the post World War II trials. You also refer to the fact that you have made known what's happening in Canada to some of my former colleagues at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS. So you've told the government these things. I noted at the outset the government did in fact vote to declare what's happening in East Turkestan as a genocide. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll ask you anyway. Do you think the Canadian government is doing enough to address this issue? And if not, what kinds of steps would you like to see the Trudeau government do to put pressure on China to protect the Uyghur diaspora here in Canada so they're not being threatened by Chinese agents?
This is timely and a very good, question you're asking. To be honest, my answer in short is no. Canada is not doing its part of it's part of the protecting well-beingness of its citizens. That would be my short answer. But in explanatory note, I would say that it is probably they start reacting now, but it's still very slow. And
Hmm.
maybe the debate we're having in Canada of, let's say, are we although it is still under consideration, but like, are we should we allow Huawei to get access to
Right.
5G
5G,
networking in
right.
Canada?
Yeah.
I mean, this itself, it shows the profound, how I even don't know how to name it, ignorance, or maybe
Ignorance, naiveness.
naiveness, or maybe being polite with the counterparts. When at the same time, when all our Five Eyes allies have
Yeah.
declared openly that they would not enter any deal in any deals with Huawei, and it is still it just shocks our our consciousness, and our it puzzles us, like,
Yeah.
quite frankly, that we're still allowing debating of whether to allow Huawei access or not. At the same time, when China is officially banned any foreign,
Yeah.
investments in 5G network, it is question of reciprocity, right?
Right.
It is not just a question of Uyghur genocide. It is being self-aware of the dangers existing, and securing its our future, and our communication lines and everything. So even from that perspective, I believe that China is far behind of our allies.
Hmm.
And to be frank, the abstention vote of the Trudeau government
Yes.
on China, it is so revealing. It showed the moral depravity and the new law, of how to do business with communist China. Even I guess I should stop here because I will get emotional, and we still have to work with this government still. So
No, I understand. I understand your hesitation, Kayum, but I cannot disagree with you. It does reach level of a moral depravity in the sense that the evidence is there, what's happening. And as you said, and I worked in the Five Eyes for more than 30 years. The fact that our partners have said quite categorically they have no desire to work with China on 5G, and yet the Trudeau government is dithering and will not take a position. For those of us who work in security intelligence, it's shocking. I think for average Canadians, it's what do you mean we're not doing this? Now I understand. You showed your coffee mug earlier, and I was looking at something I just bought from the store today, and of course it's made in China. We've allowed the Chinese economy to supplant and to replace a lot of things we used to make here. When I was growing up, very few things were made in China, and everything that was made in China was very cheap. It was a joke. If it said made in China, it was you could throw it in the garbage. That's no longer the case, but we've allowed our economy to basically be dominated by what's happening. So, do you think at the end of the day that this moral depravity, this hesitation by the government to do anything more concrete is strictly an economic argument? I'm going to assume, for argument's sake, that the government has not been infiltrated by agents of the Chinese Communist Party, and that this is actually just it's a dollars and cents thing. They believe that if they were to crack down any further, it would have a serious, catastrophic, immediate effect on the Canadian economy, and that's why they're not willing to do that. Am I being naive, or do you think that's what's really driving most of these decisions right now?
I believe question of money is the number one cornerstone of any question in bilateral relationship of Canada and China. I do believe, if you take the list of priorities for Canadian government, that would be business, and then human rights, and then international relationship and Canadian interest. Probably, a human rights issue is the very last thing to do, and
Right.
they would have to worry about it.
Unfortunately, yes, you're probably right.
But that reveals the question itself reveals the morality and the essence of our own stand. Like, where are we and as a nation, and do we stick to the moral and principles to which we adhere and declare to be part of it? And we come to the Geneva Convention on Genocide of 1948. Intervene and prevent genocide. This is happening. Unfortunately, I might understand, them being a devil's advocate, that this is the case of two Michaels right now. We have to
Mm,
work on these and secure their release first, and maybe that is a part of explanation of the bigger picture. But my argument would be, yes, Canadian government has its obligation of securing, Michaels, but for somehow we are forgetting that there is another Canadian of Uyghur origin who is
mhm.
lingering in Chinese prison for no reason, an innocent man, since 2006, and I'm
Right.
talking about Hussein Jalil.
Of course,
I
yes.
mean, there is very little or no information or advocacy on his behalf, Trudeau government. Maybe that is a part of explanation. And another
Mm,
issue is, which is a bigger issue, is the question of morality. Yes, the government has an obligation to secure the release of these two Michaels, but it has bigger morality and bigger obligation of intervention and prevention of genocide.
right. Yeah.
So they have obligation of fulfilling its obligation, its international obligation under that Geneva Convention.
Mhm.
So by securing the release of two and closing an eye on the ongoing atrocities towards
Right.
millions, I mean, the math does not it doesn't add up.
Yeah.
So, but more importantly, the question is, where we stand as a nation, what are our principles, and are
Mhm.
we going to, compromise our own reputation and our own, and I would argue even economic, well-being in the long term, if we go into negotiation table with the Chinese counterpart at this stage, and
I
even if we will be dispatching our athletes to Beijing Games 2022, for example, what kind of world do we want our kids to live in
Yeah.
after us, And I was reading the other day the good article that less than 20% of the world population live in the free world.
Mhm.
So whatever this 20% we have, and the privilege to live in free democratic society without the fear of being reprisal for expressing your opinion. We have to we should cherish this,
Yeah.
and we have to stand up. This is for not for nothing that our ancestors They shed the blood, during World War II, World War
Hmm.
One.
Yeah.
So it is more and more complex.
Yeah.
But I cannot emphasize more that we have to be and choose the side and stick to it. I mean, this is we cannot sell out our moral values for the dollar. Yes, Phil.
You're preaching to the choir here, Kayum. I agree with you
Sorry.
completely. No, no. I mean, you make some very valid points, and I think that yes, things are complicated. I've seen how the machinery of government works. I know it doesn't. You can't turn it around tomorrow, but uh, and yes, the two Michaels is a very sensitive situation. But as you said, and I'm not suggesting the Canadian government should sacrifice the two Michaels for a greater cause. But as you said, the math doesn't lie. I mean, there's a lot more happening there. In closing, Kayum, I was wondering if you could share with my listeners more about what your organization does, and I think more importantly, how the average Canadian can find out more about you, and perhaps help what you're trying to achieve here in Canada, the kind of awareness you're trying to raise.
Sure. Our organization called Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, www.urap.ca. You can visit our website. It is an Ottawa-based NGO, and we focus our attention on main issues of documenting and advocating on behalf of Uyghur people. And last year and this year, it's been quite busy. We came, successfully to the point that the Canadian Parliament adopted motion on recognizing Uyghur genocide,
Right,
and with it now it is up to the government to fulfill the choice or the how they say the will of Canadians, which was expressed by its elected officials, through
right,
its officials,
right.
parliamentarians, MPs. There are many steps which we would expect our government to take, be it implication or the fulfillment of Magnitsky Law,
Mm-hmm.
the law which penalizes those Chinese officials who are directly involved in committing this genocide, ban on Uyghur slave labor imports to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
We should not forget that 20% of the global textile ready-to-use garments come from our region,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very laborious, and it is no way that it cannot be not tainted by Uyghur slave labor.
Right,
People
right.
work 12, 14 hours for free, only for food in prison-like conditions.
Mm-hmm.
It is maybe we think about it organ harvesting. Chinese communists they committing
Yes, of
atrocities,
course.
and they take out they keep Uyghur population as living donors,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a big profitable business for communists in China to sell organs of Uyghur population. So I would argue that Canada should adopt resolution and ban all medical tourism. All Canadians going into China for getting organ transplants.
Right,
Just follow the example of Australia, for example.
right.
And then, probably we would argue that there is a humanitarian crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and there are many, like thousands and thousands Uyghur refugees stranded in the third-party countries.
Mm-hmm.
So we would advocate that they should be resettled into Canada. Maybe say on the same scale like Syrians and Yazidis and
Right.
all these vulnerable communities who are in dire situation and who face deportation
Mm-hmm.
from these countries back to China, and so on and so on. So I would advise the community public to take be aware of the situation and cross check information. You should not you. I mean, I'm not inviting to trust us like I say blindly,
Mm-hmm.
but to verify information.
Right,
What
right.
China says that this is a harmonious society. There is an ethnic harmony and peace, and Uyghur people are the happiest Muslim people in the world, and etc. etc. And we say there is a genocide going on, millions incarcerated,
Mhm.
detained, systematic rape and torture in these facilities, etc. etc.
Right.
So and take your own intelligent decision and visit our website probably urap.ca, and if you have time you can volunteer on our behalf, because as I was saying We are the newest and probably youngest and smallest community in Canada. We have
Mhm.
very limited financial and human resources, so any help, any assistance would be much appreciated. And it is not just the case of Uyghurs, particularly. This is the case of the of upcoming like a 21st century, and Chinese behavior. It will define this century,
Mhm.
and it will have a tremendous generational impact on not only Canadians but the worldwide.
Mhm.
And be attentive and work hard to preserve what we have and cherish what we have and spread this. Transparency, accountability,
Mhm.
electability, all these things, which might sound trivial for someone who grew up in Canada, but for someone like me who came from the communist society, it is very much, dear things which we hold very closely to our heart.
I think most people, unfortunately, do not have an appreciation for what they have. Like you said, if this is the only system you've ever known, it's the only country that you've lived in, the only society that you've experienced, you don't understand why the other people around the world do not have it. Kayum, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your perspectives on this. I think you're a very, very brave Canadian for doing this. I do appreciate you appearing on the podcast. I'm going to share your website with my listeners and encourage them enthusiastically to visit your website and find out more. And as an old Intel guy, you're speaking to me right to my heart when you say that when you come across information, don't always accept the information at face value. I mean, there's information, there's good information, there's bad information, there's misinformation, there's disinformation, and those of us who worked in intelligence, we were always taught to corroborate, corroborate, corroborate on multiple sources. So, if nothing else, you've reminded my listeners that getting information from multiple sources is always a good idea. So, congratulations on your effort here in Canada. Congratulations on getting the Canadian Parliament to recognize the genocide. We're both in agreement that much more has to be done, but I'm certainly going to be following you very closely, and I'm going to recommend that my listeners educate themselves about what's happening in East Turkestan and to cut through the lies that the Chinese government is putting out there. So, thank you so much for taking the time. It's much appreciated.
Oh, you're welcome, Phil. Just in wrapping up the comments, in 2001, when I went for the first time when I went to Ottawa Global Affairs, I had a meeting with a so-called specialist from the Chinese desk. And when we have introduced ourselves, saying we are Uyghurs, we've been asked, "What are you? What is Uyghur?" So these are so-called specialists at the Chinese desk of the global affairs, and we came a long way. In 2020, parliamentarian subcommittee adopted Uyghur genocide, and this is now happening. So, but I would suggest, be curious what is happening in the world. Don't be just, don't do not exclude yourself. And because if you're not going to reach out the world will come and reaching out to you. So that's,
That,
yeah.
that's a really good point. I've always advocated that being curious is a good thing. They say that curiosity killed the cat, but I've always thought that being curious is the way we should do. So, again, Kayum, thank you so much for taking the time today.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Have a nice day. Thank you, Phil.
So that was my conversation with Kayum Masimov. He is from the Uyghur Network here in Canada. What do you think about what's happening? Do you think Canada's doing enough to push back against Chinese interference with Canadian citizens? I don't, but I'm curious what you think. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter at borealissaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like this content and want to get more, go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You get a free daily digest on all these matters, blogs, podcasts, etc. And you'll also find a link to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, on the website. You can order it because it's self-published. It's only available there. I'll love to hear what you think of this podcast. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.